Das ist Kunst. Der Podcast der Deichtorhallen Hamburg.
You see, the thing about a photographer, even with a retrospective of 300 prints, basically, I'm as good as my next picture.
Ralph Gibson. The following interview with the artist was held in English and via video call. Das Gespräch wurde auf Englisch und per Videotelefonat geführt. Secret of Light. Die Ausstellung in der Halle für aktuelle Kunst zeigt ausgesuchte Serien des US-amerikanischen Fotografen Ralph Gibson von den 1960er Jahren bis heute. Um die 300 Fotografien, schwarz-weiß und Farbe, analog und digital, sind zu sehen. Zusammengestellt aus dem privaten Bestand des Künstlers und aus Arbeiten, die der Sammler F.C. Gundlach während seiner Zusammenarbeit mit Ralph Gibson Anfang der 1980er Jahre für seine Sammlung gekauft hat. Ralph Gibson ist 1939 in Los Angeles geboren. Prägende Kindheitserfahrungen machte Gibson in Hollywood. Sein Vater war in den 1940er Jahren als Regieassistent für Warner Brothers tätig, assistierte Alfred Hitchcock und der junge Ralph Gibson kam oft als Statist zum Einsatz. Das heiße Licht der Cohen-Bogenlampen auf den Hollywood-Filmsets der 40er und 50er Jahre wurde zum nachhaltigen Einfluss auf Gibsons fotografische Arbeit. Seine Biografie führt ihn von der Kindheit in Hollywood im Rahmen einer Fotografenausbildung in die US-Marine und die Dunkelkammer des Marineschiffs USS Tanner. Auf dem Weg zur eigenständigen künstlerischen Karriere arbeitet Ralph Gibson unter anderem als Assistent der US-amerikanischen Dokumentarfotografin Dorothea Lange und landet schließlich in New York, dem künstlerischen Schmelztiegel der Gegenkultur in den USA der 1960er und 70er Jahre. Aus dieser Zeit heraus entsteht The Black Trilogy. Die 3 Fotoserien The Somnambulist, Déjà-vu und Days at Sea, die Ralph Gibson ab 1970 als Fotobücher in seinem eigenen Verlag Lustrum Press veröffentlicht. Diese 3 Serien legen den Grundstein für Ralph Gibsons wachsende Bekanntheit und sein internationales Renommee und zeigen eindrucksvoll einige der Grundlagen von Gibsons fotografischer Handschrift. Licht, Schatten, Kontraste, abstrakte und surreale Momente, die keine Geschichte erzählen, aber einen roten Faden haben. Gibson ist nicht daran interessiert, mit seinen Fotos zu dokumentieren oder lineare Erzählungen abzubilden. Es geht ihm vielmehr darum, eine eigene Sprache und ästhetische Realität in seinen Bildern zu schaffen. Ich habe mit Ralph Gibson über seine spannende Biografie und seinen fotografischen Werdegang gesprochen. Darüber, wie er seine eigene, unverkennbare visuelle Signatur entwickelt hat. Und über seine zweite Leidenschaft neben der Fotografie, die Musik. Denn Ralph Gibson ist nicht nur Fotograf, sondern auch passionierter Gitarrist. Hier im Hintergrund und im Verlauf der Folge hören wir Ausschnitte aus seinem Auftritt bei der Ausstellungseröffnung in den Deichtorhallen. Zum Einstieg habe ich Ralph Gibson gefragt, ob er sich noch an den Moment, an seine Lebenssituation erinnern kann, als ihm klar wurde, dass er Fotograf sein will.
Of course, it will take me a moment. Little backstory. So I grew up in Hollywood in the 40s and 50s. It was a very glamorous childhood with a lot of movie stars. My father he was assistant to Alfred Hitchcock, and I was on the set a lot, and I worked in a few movies as a child. And it was a great life until when I was about 13, my parents started drinking heavily, and it led to divorce. Very ugly. I was out of the house. I failed high school, and I was out of the house at 16. I had my choice of military school or the Navy. And I was 16 and a half. So I said, I'll go in the Navy. And I had to wait 6 months because they take you in the Navy at 17. So I worked as a mechanic in a sports car garage. Then I went in the Navy the morning I turned 17. And I took a bunch of tests. And they said, well, we're going to put you in the control tower at the airport because you did very well on these tests. I said, okay, I don't care, They said, you don't care? Well, there's somebody who really wants this. We'll send you to photographer school. I said, okay. So I went to photographer school and I failed. I failed the course about halfway in. And then I realized, here I am, 17. I failed high school. I failed my family. I thought it was my fault, the divorce, right? And now I'm failing photography. So I wrote the captain a letter asking to be readmitted. And he let me back in, but there wasn't a class forming for 6 weeks or something. So I had to clean the barracks latrine for 6 weeks,
So you
I
started
very humble
all the way down there, yeah.
Yeah, I started very low. And I went through photo school very brilliantly. And then I'm at my first ship crossing the North Atlantic coming to Europe. At 3:00 in the morning, I'm standing watch, and the ship is going up and down, and it's thunder and rain and lightning, and I'm just miserable. And I look up at the sky and I shout, I'm going to be a photographer. And at that moment, my destiny was fixed. At 17 and a half, I knew what my life was going to be. Now,
so
this is like
an epiphany, kind of.
Inheriting a fortune at 17,
Yeah.
A lot of people don't know what they want to do in their life, But I always knew from that moment I was going to be a photographer.
You did take, I think, some of your inspirations that still inform your work to this day from that really early time that you spent like as a child extra on the sets of films in Hollywood.
That is absolutely true. In those days, they did not have a ceiling on the movie sets. They had passages you could walk, and they put these enormous lights there because the film was very slow. And so it was orthochromatic.
Because we're talking about like the 40s, 50s.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
All those films that you see, those old movies you see on television. And so they were very contrasty. And I have no doubt that later when I was in the darkroom starting to look for an interesting print, a print that had some kind of a presence to it, that my interest in contrast might have started there.
What do you think are the main influences that kind of defined your approach to being creative then? You were an assistant to one of the most impactful, influential early American documentary photographers, Dorothea Lange. Mm-hmm. I think you've said in the past that you took a lot from that experience of working for her.
Well, it's very interesting because I was in the Navy for in the darkroom at sea for 2.5 years, and I slept in the darkroom deck, and I had an inflatable mattress, and all day I would either play guitar or print or develop, and I just didn't come out. I didn't like the guys on the ship; they're all rednecks, and I was reading Keats and Shelley and playing my guitar and trying to catch up with my friends that I left in Los Angeles who are in college now, and I became, just without even knowing it, I became very good technically. I was, in terms of, you have to understand that we're talking about 1957, 58. Films were very slow. Lenses were slow. The only thing that was good was the paper because it had tremendous amount of silver in it. But you had to work for years to master the darkroom because it was kind of a mystique. There was an alchemy to the photographer in the darkroom. And so I came out and I went to art school in San Francisco. I came out of the Navy and Dorothea was looking for an assistant, and I just got the job immediately.
Because you were so good already, probably too, right?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. And so the first day in her darkroom, I realized that she was not much about the darkroom, barely understood it. But what she did understand was how to put content in her pictures. She had a photograph of what I thought was a young woman standing in front of a wooden wall house or something with dark circles under her eyes. I said, we had been printing it all day long, dozens and dozens of prints. I said, Dorothea, tell me the story of this woman. And she said, well, Raphael, she's not a woman. She was a young girl and she was retarded. And the other students tortured her. The other kids in the migrant camps tortured her. And while Dorothy was talking, she started crying about this girl.
Even though this picture was taken
40
years ago?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I said, well, how do you have a photograph that can give you this experience? So I started realizing that what I was looking for in photography was not going to be found in great technique. That was not the key to content. That was a huge lesson. And then later, after about a year, she said, you may show me your work, Raphael. And I did. And she said, you have no point of departure. And I said, that's true, Dorothea. What is a point of departure? And she gave me what turned out to be the key to my career. I'm sitting here talking to you because she said, if you're going down to the drugstore to buy toothpaste, because you were directed and you have your camera, you might intersect an event. But if you just go down to Market Street in San Francisco and drift around, you won't find anything. Oh. And probably if you go talk to 10 photographers, 9 out of 10 will say they like to drift around. But so I didn't understand that. What she really meant about point of departure. I went back to LA for a year or so, and I did a book on the Sunset Strip. And then I went to New York, and I showed that, and I was invited into Magnum, this picture agency at the time, which was a big deal. I was 27.
Yeah, that would have been really big news for anyone back then, I guess.
Yes. But after 3 months, I realized there was something wrong. This isn't what I wanted. This wasn't me. I had a picture of a burning beauty parlor, which was commemoration to my mother. And I started photographing in a much more personal way without calculating that I was doing that, you see. Things were happening in my work that had not happened before. When I was a little boy, I used to sometimes sit in a chair looking like this with my eyes open without blinking. And I'd get very trancy. My mother said, what are you doing? I said, I'm feeling trancy. And it's basically the same feeling that I have now when I look at something long enough to photograph it. I was basically a photographer before I knew it.
You start seeing something that you might not see if you just take a glance at it, I suppose.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, the shapes and the forms and the lines that somehow speak to you and then make you realize, oh, I think that this is something that speaks to me and that I can also speak with, that I can create my language with.
Well, you're 100% correct there, because throughout my entire career, I have wanted to kind of eliminate the subject matter. And the only subject in my pictures is my perception of maybe this glass or the corner of this chair or something. I want that, but that coincides with a lot of philosophical thought, much of which started in Germany with Nietzsche and Heidegger and Husserl.
I was just going to ask. You've always had an affinity to European art, European philosophy, writing. That's something that started early on in your life too, right?
It's true because outside of working in the movies, when I was in Los Angeles in the 40s and 50s, it was just a bunch of cowboys, Dust Bowl farmers, and it was not at all an interesting place to be. It was very
American, I guess.
yeah, but not in a particularly good way.
Okay.
You see.
Yeah.
It didn't have any of what we would call the attributes. It had all the big attribute of America is potential. You can do anything you want. That's the thing. But I went to New York and I brought out my first book, which brought me success. And I took my first trip to Europe in 1971. And with the exception of the pandemic, I've come to Europe 4 or 5 times a year since then. During the pandemic, I just yearned for Europe.
Yeah. Like you just said, you took or tried to take subject matter out of your pictures during your career. That was something that you realized pretty early. I was wondering, is that kind of that you felt commercial photography, documentary photography? I mean, those are two different things, obviously. But did you kind of feel that practice like lacking maybe some kind of pleasure or passion that you were looking for?
Well, when I started freelancing in Los Angeles and then later in New York, I would work for graphic designers and they'd give me something to do. And then they would say, well, this is great, but this is for a museum. This is not what we're looking for. We're here to sell this stuff. And a really great commercial photographer. Now, listen, I was Helmut Newton was like my older brother, and he was a great commercial photographer. And we discussed this issue a lot. Now, I just didn't happen to be one. I thought I was. But it very quickly became apparent that I didn't want anybody to tell me what to photograph and then subsequently tell me whether or not it's a good photograph. You see, I'll be the client, and I have a much higher level. For me to sign my name to a picture, you know, I have to work very hard to achieve that. But I'm no longer arrogant about not working commercially. I didn't work commercially for 50 years. And then I'd get a few phone calls, mostly fashion, at the very top of the profession. And I know you understand the fees involved at that.
Of course.
So I said, well, let's try it, you know.
Yeah.
And Helmut had always said to me, Ralphie, fashion is easy. Just get the hair and makeup right.
And that's not even your job, you know? I mean.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah. So I did a few things. Every 2 or 3 years, somebody called me to do something. But I like it for the first day because of the glitz and the hoopla, but by the second day, I'm bored still. Yeah.
I think you do have some really great fashion photography in your work, though, I would have to say. Let's talk about music, because it's not just photography. Since you were a teenager, music has played a big role. You started playing guitar as a teenager. I found a quote of yours where you said, "Melody is to music what reality is to photography." And I love that. I love that quote because it just makes sense that, you know, you would have this passion, but it kind of intertwines with your other passion.
It completely does, because you see, I spent most of my life refining my vision. And if you're doing that, you say to yourself, well, how do I refine my hearing? Because they're very close to one another. Now, when I wrote that statement, I was working on my autobiography, and I was at a dinner party with Philip Glass, and I said, Philip, what do you think of this statement? Reality is to photography, what melody is to music. Music,
what reality is to photography.
Instantly replied. He said, well, I can do without melody, but I could never do without harmony. You see, he put it at exactly the point where music turns to art. It's not the melody line, it's how you harmonize it, that the abstraction enters into the experience. You know, that's what's so amazing about somebody like Arvo Part or some of these great composers. So I play every day. My guitar is right there on the floor, and I'm curious to know how much music I have if I bring it all out.
Yeah, I was wondering, did you ever try to play in a band, or did you like write something that we would call songs?
I had a terrible rock and roll band in the 70s called Sex and Drugs. And
sounds pretty right for the time.
we played at loft parties in Soho. You know, we're all in our early 30s, and we weren't very good, but people loved to dance, and so we you know. And one time we were playing on Prince Street at this loft, and it was a black lady, a painter, and it was a rent party where we agreed to play, and she would charge $5 for everybody who came. She could pay the rent that month. And we're playing Johnny Be Good or something like that, you know. And we look out on the dance floor. Oh my God, there's Ornette Coleman. Oh fuck, there's Ornette. So we kind of shut down, you know. And he comes up to the bandstand and he says, "You guys are sounding better." Now, better than what?
So your performances, which you do from time to time, playing guitar live in front of an audience, is that kind of always attached to your art? I mean, you played at the opening of the exhibition at Deichtorhallen, but you've also played with, like, you know, visuals in the background in certain like art settings. How does that connect, and how does music, performing music, differ to you, like to photography, maybe from the feeling that you have while doing it?
Well, you know, the performing arts are completely different. As a photographer, I have complete autonomy, and I don't release a picture or a book until it pleases me. And then I really don't care what anybody else thinks, because it got past me, and that's But music is a whole other thing because it's an interaction with the listener. Now, the great English philosopher Walter Pater stated that all arts aspire towards the condition of music. Now, this is an interesting concept, but when I perform, because you see, it's generally considered that the best experience of music you could have is performing it yourself. The next is hearing it live, and after that, the next is hearing it recorded. But when you play, you're not really listening because your whole nervous system is engaged. So listening is a small part of the experience, which all serves to make me extremely vulnerable. Now, in that vulnerability, I let it all hang out, for better or for worse. That's simply what it is. I have a captive audience. The people already like me, or they wouldn't have come to my show, you know? And so it's a different method of introspection technique.
When you came to New York in the 60s, New York was kind of like the epicenter of the intellectual counterculture, I would say, like poetry, philosophy, film, music, and you lived at another epicenter within the epicenter for a couple years at the Chelsea Hotel. You were a regular at Max's Kansas City, one of the coolest nightclubs of the 60s, early 70s. Yeah, I mean, I guess I can't really tell, but yeah, you can hear. I'm kind of jealous of that experience. So I would like to know a little bit about it. Like, what was that time like? I mean, how did it actually come to being that you moved into the Chelsea Hotel?
Well, it's a very funny story. A friend of mine who was more established as a photographer, Bruce Davison, was in Los Angeles, and he said, "I've just got an assignment." Davison was out on the West Coast working on the national parks. He said, "If you come back, if you drive my camper back to New York, I'll pay your rent at the Chelsea and I'll give you $200."
Sounds like
a
fair deal.
I was just waiting for a chance to get out of Los Angeles. That's all I wanted to do. Every time I saw a green light at the traffic signal, I said, could that be my way out? And so I went to New York with $200 and a week at the Chelsea. Nobody in LA understood my work. They just didn't get it. A few graphic designers, but they couldn't. I was really, really having a hard time. So I went to New York and I had an appointment to see this newspaper that had a Sunday supplement called the Herald Tribune. And they had a supplement called New York, which later became New York Magazine. But anyway, I'm standing in front of the Chelsea and I say to this cab driver, little cab driver, old guy, I said, take me down to 1 Water Street. He said, Water Street, you're going to the Tribune. I said, that's right. How do you know? He says, 44 years behind this wheel. If you want to know what, I'll tell you what. So I go down and I see this editor, Clay Felker, very famous guy in American journalism. And he says, I like your work, kid. Do you have any ideas? So I closed my eyes like this and a flash went off in my head. I said, yes, Mr. Felker, let's do a piece on the 4 oldest cab drivers in New York. He said, I like the way you think. Yes, okay, So, 1 week into Manhattan, I'm already working. By the second week, I'm presented to Magnum. So things are...
You must have had some lucky star up there.
One night at Max's, I run into Robert Frank, whom I said, I want to show you my work. He said, great, come tomorrow. And so I went to see him. And then he says, well, I'm not doing still, but I'm working on movies and I need some help. So I'm in town 3-4 weeks, a month, and all of a sudden, I'm where I really want to be, where I could become me, you know?
Yeah, in an environment that kind of opens up opportunities that you probably wouldn't have had in Los Angeles.
More than probably. Absolutely would never. Because I wasn't aligned with their thinking in Los Angeles. Whereas in New York, in the 60s, it was basically, you could argue that New York in the 60s was in the 70s was a center of culture and Western civilization, simply stated. Everything was going on there. So many major talents were in their 20s. And, it's the same thing as when you hang out in your crowd, wherever you go, wherever you guys hang. Once in a while, new people come in and you're meeting. And I could give you a list of names that would really blow your mind because we were just there. We weren't there by
Give me some names. Give me some names. Well, I know Leonard Cohen, for example, because you had kind of a multidisciplinary overlap, like playing guitar for him on his album New Skin for the Old Century, right? How did you meet?
It's funny. I was just sitting on the roof of the Chelsea on a early summer day playing with my girlfriend, and Leonard walked up with his guitar. And I had seen him around. I knew who he was, but we hadn't chatted. And we played for 3 hours. Then we started talking, Now, you cannot design that kind of experience. It just occurs in your life. When in 1968, there was probably 4 billion people on planet Earth. And so the art world was a lot smaller. Your generation, the creative people, there's probably a hell of a lot more people. Now, at the same time, the market has gotten much bigger and more lucrative. It's always difficult for one reason or another.
Yeah. Well, your difficulties at that time, if I understand correctly, were definitely still like kind of being penniless a lot of the time, always having, I heard you say you always had like 2 of your cameras at the pawn shop. I feel like that must have been some kind of like existential experience that probably taught you a lot too.
Well, you know what? Honestly, Friederike, I didn't like having a hard time, but I never doubted for an instant that I was going to succeed. You see, we go back to that little moment, that epiphany on the fantail of the USS Tanner. I always knew, no matter how tough it got, that sooner or later, even though I couldn't have done it if I tried, I was never obliged to compromise my work. I couldn't sell out if I tried because nobody was buying, you see.
What I kind of was wondering is you started creating and putting out your work in photo books via your own publishing company, Lustrum Press. You started doing that very early on, releasing your own work. And I kind of feel like that could kind of trace back to the spirit of that time too, like the 60s and the 70s, like not wanting to wait for someone to discover your talent and put your vision out the way you intended, just going DIY and doing it yourself.
In my case, it was, I had, occasionally I'd have stuff in magazines, and I never liked the reproduction or the layout. I just wanted autonomy, all the credit, all the blame. My Faustian pact in the darkest moments of the longest nights was that I just wanted to be able to do my work the way I wanted to do it. And that's basically what I got,
You started working with like series of photos. With what you called at some point, you started calling it the Black Trilogies, The Somnambulist from 1970, Déjà Vu, and Days at Sea. It seems like it's almost like a scientific test series kind of approach. You don't really know what the outcome is going to be. You just know what you're interested in seeing, kind of. How would you explain that?
Well, a book sequence essentially is part to part, part to whole. See, I'll start with a 2-page spread, but then I could take the page left and I could go 10 pages into the book and compare that to page right, and it should also correspond in some fashion. There should be a resonance, which is essentially a musical construct. I learned a lot. I apply a lot of musical principles to my sequencing of books, but there are certain factors about a book, which is that, among which are included, when you look at a book, you're sitting in a chair when you feel like it pretty much, and you are at a specific distance. If you're nearsighted, it's an inch or two. If you're farsighted, it's an inch or two. But basically, the mise en page, the 2-page spread, is such that I can control the viewer's relationship to what I am trying to do. If I can see it on the page, what I'm trying to do, then supposedly somebody else could as well. And then it was, in those days, the book was the ultimate delivery system for a certain kind of photography. Whether or not that's the most effective delivery system today is another discussion. As my life unfolded, I've had a consistently expanding series of concerns that I want to examine as an artist. The idea of making a dream book now, you see, I really didn't want to repeat myself. I consciously said, I got recognition for Somnambulist, but I'm not going to do Son of Somnambulist.
Yeah.
But at the end of every project, there's a few photographs that are harbingers of the next project, which led me to Deja Vu, and which has led me now to, I'm working on a thing called Theorem. I've become very interested in semiotics and critical thinking and stuff like that in the last 10 years.
It's kind of interesting that there's, you don't like write under the pictures, this is what I'm trying to show here, but you have like this overarching idea and that we can see if we want to. We don't have to see it in the pictures.
Well, you see, I've always considered the title of my works as the proscenium in a theater. You see, you're sitting in the audience, behind this arc, anything is possible. So it sounds stupid, but instead of saying the somnambulist with a brief prologue, where I said, while sleeping, we reappear elsewhere, I could have said 48 photographs by Ralph, and the context would have totally shifted, right?
Right.
So this brought me into thinking about the context of a photograph. See, I could do a figure of a nude, and I could say the breast of the Venus de Milo, or I could say still no cure for breast cancer. And you see, you've got a very different approach to the same image.
Yeah.
So working in books, I always control the context.
Another way of controlling what is in your pictures is that the close-up, and we see that a lot in Days at Sea, a little bit in Deja Vu already in those series that you did in the 70s, focusing on just a detail, and that kind of gives you more control over your work. I mean, we see sometimes just a button or a close-up of someone's skin or hair. How did you find that? How did that come to you?
Well, other than the fact that I was responding to an impulse, a desire to move in closer with my camera, I actually think we go back to when I was on the set, watching them do what they call inserts, close-ups with this giant camera, a hand on the glass, and the camera comes here, very dramatic, because I feel that in the close-up, there is an inherent tactility where we emotionally process what it is, what it feels like. I was just drawn in that direction, but I think it has a lot to do with my generation, too. The Greeks have the word solipsism. It's a fundamental of Greek philosophy. A thumbnail definition is solipsism states how you feel determines how you perceive reality. Therefore, the only thing that's real is how you feel. Now, this is great for the artist, for the poet. It's no good for the brain surgeon or the engineer or the.
I have another interesting quote that I read of yours. I don't want to make abstract photographs. I'm interested in the abstract within things that I photograph. And I think that kind of becomes really apparent in some of those pictures where, it's not abstract. We can see what it is. It is like a button, or it is hair, it is skin, but it tells like its own tale. It has its own language. It creates a new language, kind of.
Well, any photographer that you admire, his or her work, or their work, I should say, any photographer that you admire is recognizable by a certain series of signs and visual markers. We'll call this a visual signature. You don't need to look for the credit line for a Cartier-Bresson. You can see it from across the parking lot, you know. This was an essential thing because photography, you just need a strong index finger, you know. There's no real craft to it any longer that has to be mastered. But perception, of course, is the ultimate dimension of our experience. And so we admire the work of the people whose perceptions tend to fulfill. You look at a work of art, a great painting or something, you respond, and it's because that painting fulfills something that you are trying to develop within yourself. You hear it in music, it makes you cry. You see it in a photograph and you recognize it, not just because it's a button, because there's other components triggered by the button, ancillary to the button. So with this in mind, it's not the photograph that we're discussing, it's the effect it produces. I am currently working from a point of view where I've asked myself, how does the mind influence the mind? Do not be the observer, be the one being observed. Well, I can photograph from this place and access visual territory that I might not otherwise even see, much less perceive. Don't get me started.
You, as long as you have been a photographer, you've witnessed several big shifts and changes within the practice of photography. You've referred to yourself as belonging to a middle generation of photographers from the 20th century. You've witnessed some of those fundamental shifts. You came in at a time where photography just started to be appreciated in the art world.
Yes, that's exactly true. Well, there's always a set of conditions that are essential components to any social shift or any movement. You can always look at something and, in retrospect, probably be able to determine how or why it transpired. In the case of art photography, several things occurred. I came along with a book that nobody had used the medium to describe that in that nonlinear narrative. And at the same time, we had a situation where from the 30s forward, all through the 40s, Life magazine was providing visual stimulus on a weekly basis. And in fact, the consequences of this was it was creating a visually literate demographic, which had not previously existed. People were learning how to read photographs. I would run home after school on Friday to see Life magazine. I couldn't prevent myself from running because I wanted to see on the page. But by the time I got out of the Navy and started working seriously, that's why I've never been a misunderstood artist. People have always understood my work on one level or another. And I'm not talking about people with PhDs in art history, you know. So we do have, at the time I arrived, and many of my colleagues of my generation, we had a world of visually literate, well, in Western Europe and America, certainly, you know. My middle generation continued to develop during the interruption of World War II, but it was interesting how by the 80s, see, let's say my generation was very strong in the 70s initially. Now look at some of the changes that started happening in the 80s with guys like Gursky and Struth and Roof and these people. They came along really good.
Color photography, for example, that was still not very common in the 70s, among art photographers at least, right?
Correct. That was because, that really easily to explain, because the colors were so bad. There were photomechanical dyes within which all you could really do is go for saturation. Inkjet printing was a tremendous gift to the advance. The entire inkjet printing and the entire digital evolution was a tremendous boon to it. The last great decision I've made in my life was to turn digital about 12 years ago. And I'm working as if I had a studio with 10 assistants.
Yeah, I was just going to ask because what I think is probably unusual, I don't know if many other photographers could put the first photo that they took digitally in an exhibition. You did. It's in the exhibition at Deichtorhallen, and it's a really great photo. But I was also wondering, how did you experience the rise of the dawn of digital photography for someone who spent like 50 years working in the darkroom, who learned the whole craft from there? Did you have mixed feelings in the beginning?
Well, I was going to Australia, so before I left, Leica sent some people to ask if I want to put my name on a monochrome, a black and white Leica camera. I said, I don't care, I'm not interested. They said, well, could we at least send you the prototype? I said, sure. Yeah. So I went to Australia and I had a prepared answer. I love telling this story. So I'm in the giant museum in Sydney, and I said, I'm showing my work, on this. And I said, any questions? The guy said, yeah. I said, what's your name, sir? He says, I'm Dave. I said, excuse me? No, Dave. My name is Dave. Name's Dave. So I said, what's the question, Dave? And he said, I had prepared this answer. He said, what about digital? And I said, well, the history of photography has been etched into the emulsion of black and white film, and color will resist the epic pursuit. Oh, thank you, sir.
Wow.
So then I went. That was my view on digital.
Yeah.
So then I came back to my studio. There's a camera, and I'm looking at it. I go to see my shrink, and I'm laying on her couch. I don't know what to do with this. I put it on automatic, and then outside her office, and I get that picture. Well, listen. I know when I'm getting what I'm looking for. Even when it's what I'm looking for at my best, when it happens.
Yeah.
I said, this camera is capable of doing anything I'm capable of asking it to do. And I have not loaded a roll of Triax since that time.
Wow. Yeah.
We can discuss the La Lune en français or La Luna in Italiano. It's the same moon, different language. And I love the digital language.
You mentioned at the opening of the exhibition that maybe also due to digital, it's actually a mid-career retrospective.
Yeah. I mean, I keep myself in shape physically because it's the same thing as cleaning my lens. It's just part of the machine. I'm very curious. You see, the thing about a photographer, even with a retrospective of 300 prints, basically, I'm as good as my next picture. I'm good enough as a photographer to know how good I really could be if I were able to achieve it. And I'm good enough as a musician to know how good I will never be. So that's another position.
Das war mein Gespräch mit Ralph Gibson. Geführt wurde das Interview übrigens per Video aus den Byte FM Studios im Bunker in der Hamburger Feldstraße. Genau dort im Bunker, genauer gesagt in der PPS-Galerie, hatte Ralph Gibson 1981 schon eine Ausstellung. Die PPS-Galerie, 1975 gegründet, war eine der ersten Galerien für Fotografie in Deutschland. Geführt von FC Gundlach, dessen Sammlung wiederum als Dauerleihgabe im Haus der Fotografie in den Hamburger Deichtorhallen untergebracht ist und einige Arbeiten von Ralph Gibson enthält, die ihr in der aktuellen Ausstellung Secret of Light in den Deichtorhallen sehen könnt. Das war eine neue Folge von Das ist Kunst, dem Podcast der Deichtorhallen Hamburg in Zusammenarbeit mit Byte FM. Mehr Infos zu Ralph Gibson und der Ausstellung in der Halle für aktuelle Kunst findet ihr auch in den Shownotes dieser Folge. Wenn euch der Podcast gefällt, dann hinterlasst uns doch gerne eine Bewertung oder empfehlt ihn weiter. Ihr könnt uns auch gerne schreiben, und zwar an dasistkunst@deichtorhallen.de. Wir freuen uns über euer Feedback. Ich bin Friederike Herr und sage Tschüss. Wenn ihr mögt, bis zum nächsten Mal.